Hello, dear ones. Again, thank you for the intermission where you were waiting for me and Dr. Dale Bredesen. Now, Dr. Bredesen, you are one of the kings in my world. You're a friggin' hormone hero. I just absolutely love you, and I love your wife, and I love the work you've done. Now, for people who don't know, Dr. Bredesen is, you're internationally recognized. You say your name, and most people now have a recognition that you're the man who has taken, this hopeless condition called Alzheimer's disease, where really there's no treatment and there's no cure and there's no way to approach it. And you've created a container where we see multiple factors that can create decline in the brain. Now, you would think that this was something that doctors do, what causes neurodegenerative decline, but we don't. So, your book, The End of Alzheimer's Disease, I would say was a bomb going off in neurology. So I'm so grateful that you're here and just really, really grateful to have you. So now we have our neurologist speaking about hormones and health. And listen, welcome, Dr. Bredesen.
Thanks so much, Prudence, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, one of the beautiful things about your work is that you've really given people specific things to do about their neuroregeneration. But before we go into that, what would you say are some of the, the causes for the brain not functioning well? Because just to say a little bit, you've been a researcher. For how many years were you a researcher?
Yeah, so 30 years I spent in the lab looking at what actually drives it. And of course, the idea was, this is an area, as you know, this has been the area of greatest biomedical therapeutic failure. As they say, everyone knows a cancer survivor, no one knows an Alzheimer's survivor. This has been a wasteland. It's been so unfortunate. ALS, again, it's a terminal illness. Frontotemporal dementia, terminal illness. Lewy body disease, terminal illness. It's just been horrible. And of course, as you indicated, people who have tried to treat these have done it without respect to what's actually causing it, which of course really makes no sense. It's like taking your car into the mechanic and the mechanic says, oh yeah, we know what this is. This is car not working syndrome. And you say, well, don't you want to ask why it's not working? No, we just fill each one with gas and sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. Well, that's not the way the brain works. So the whole idea of the research over all these years was to see if we could understand the fundamental nature of this process. What's the molecular biology driving this? And as you indicated, of course, hormones play an important role in this. And what we found over the years is, you talk frequently about philosophy, and I think that's a great point. We wanted to understand the philosophy of Alzheimer's. If you think about it, it's really crazy. This is 15% of the population dies from this illness. As Professor Christine Yaffe has shown, this is now the third leading cause of death in the United States. So if you really understand the philosophy of this disease, you would understand why it's so common, why we're seeing it more. It's clearly on the increase, why it's been so difficult to treat, how to prevent it, and how to reverse it. So you really have a model. And so we've been interested in the conceptual model for Alzheimer's disease. What is it? What's going on in your brain? And so what we found is really interesting. It turns out that there is this beautiful switch in your brain, which is integrating all of these things for you. It's looking at what is your estradiol level and your thyroid and pregnenolone and progesterone and testosterone and vitamin D. And are you under attack? Do you have your NF-kappa B activated because you've got specific inflammatory compounds or inflammatory pathogens? Do you P. gingivalis from your dentition that's now in your brain? And that's exactly what you find in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. All sorts of pathogens, herpes simplex, HHV6A, P. gingivalis, T. denticola, candida, on and on and on. These things are all found in the brains of patients with Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's is essentially the neurosyphilis of the 21st century. It's the thing that is getting to so many of us, but that the big difference is there are many different organisms and different toxins, and of course, different metabolic changes. As so many, about 80 million of us, develop metabolic syndrome, guess what? We are increasing our risk dramatically. as we get exposed to more processed foods and sugar. So what happened to us, which was really strange, was we came from the test tube. And when we finally see, okay, here's how we can translate this into something that, as you said, is something that's active each day for human beings. Of course, all of the colleagues who had not come from the test tube and looking at, oh, let's get rid of that amyloid, let's get rid of the tau, it doesn't really make any sense. They're not addressing what's causing this. They're addressing mediators. No question, amyloid is a mediator of the pathophysiology. But it's what's really interesting is what's come up with COVID-19. So we're all sheltering in place now. We're all where you have your virtual meeting here, all because of COVID-19. And this is directly analogous to what happens in Alzheimer's, because people always say, well, how can amyloid be both a protective mechanism, which I mentioned in the book, and also a destructive mechanism? Well, it's directly analogous. What did we all have to do with COVID-19? We shelter in place, we social distance, and so what happens? Our economy is shrinking. We are shrinking in our interactions, in our one-on-one daily face-to-face interactions. So we have a protective, but we also have a destructive. And that's exactly what happens in Alzheimer's. And then what happens? We say, okay, we now want to reopen society. So people start going out, but we're reopening it without getting at the root cause of why we sheltered in place. So everybody starts getting sick again. This is, again, exactly what happened when people have tried to remove the amyloid. They're removing a media. They're literally reopening the economy and the society without getting rid of the upstream. So what happens? They actually get worse, and all of the various trials, they haven't gotten better. So we're seeing all of these parallels. And of course, all of the comorbidities we think about with COVID-19, the obesity, the hypertension, the type 2 diabetes, all of these things are seen in Alzheimer's, even to the hypercoagulable state that you see with COVID-19, and even the fact that you're at increased risk for strokes. All of these things. In Alzheimer's, it's a 20-year window, and COVID-19 has compressed this down to 2 weeks. So yes, all of these things, as you have things that are affecting your hormones, as you have things that are toxic exposures that most people are, and that's been the biggest problem. People don't know that they are living in a pro-Alzheimer's state. And so they go merrily along, and what we used to think of as a disease of our 60s, 70s, and 80s turns out to be a disease of our 40s, 50s, and 60s, which happens to be diagnosed in our 60s, 70s, and 80s. But these things are at work. Even in our 30s, these things are at work. As you know, with all these children, younger people now, getting type 2 diabetes, having issues with metabolic syndrome, these are all placing them at much greater risk for Alzheimer's disease. And as I wrote in the book, you can literally induce the neurochemistry of Alzheimer's just by changing your life. You can do it within a few weeks. You won't have a diagnosis for a decade or two, but you can, just by doing the wrong things, you can really impact your risk dramatically. And just by doing the right things, you can de-risk dramatically.
Oh, that's beautiful. So just to kind of, encapsulate that. So sugar is a root core cause, the insulin resistance, inflammation, toxicity, whether it be heavy metals or, from the inside or the outside, and then also all the viruses and anything else that is at play here in terms of.
That's been one of the big issues. When you go into your expert in Alzheimer's, they look at a very small data set and they simply tell you, we don't know what causes this. There's nothing that helps it. We're going to put you on a medicine like Aricept or Namenda. It's going to do very little. You're going to continue going down. And so as we started looking at much larger data sets, and of course, again, this is standard for looking for integrative and functional medicine, no surprise, but it's not been standard of care, as you well know. And so as we started looking and saying, well, okay, let's translate what we saw in the test tube. If these pathways are being activated, then we want to know what's upstream of those pathways. And so what we found is that there are subtypes, and they go basically to what you just said. There's a type 1 or inflammatory. So anything, whether you're inflamed because of a leaky gut or because of poor dentition or because of chronic sinusitis or on and on and on, or because of poor hormone support, anything that is creating that inflammatory state, that gives you an increased risk for Alzheimer's. Because if you look at the amyloid that collects, that the pathologist must see to call it Alzheimer's, is part of your innate immune system. So all the pathologist is really telling you is something happened in your brain by which your brain, that led your brain to make stuff that is pro-inflammatory. Your brain is fighting something, in other words. So that's type 1. Type 2 is atrophic. No surprise, your brain is working to do this stuff. And in fact, if you don't support it enough, then you have a very different type of Alzheimer's, type 2, or atrophic or cold Alzheimer's. This is because you have low vitamin D, low estradiol, low testosterone, all these supportive things, low nerve growth factor, low BDNF, low B12. These are all critical to keep your 500 trillion plus synapses functioning. And by the way, you've got to have the energy to function. And that's one of the biggest problems. These people have low energy brains. Their mitochondria are not functioning. You can see that macroscopically when you do an FDG PET scan. You can see this stripe temporally, parietally, where you have reduced glucose utilization. And in the past, people always thought, oh yeah, it's because you've lost some brain, so you don't need that. Well, no, it turns out it's because you are not able to utilize that glucose, in part because you have insulin resistance. Then we have type 1.5, which is glycotoxic, and that is because of it's got a combination. It has an inflammatory component because of the glycation of the proteins, of course, but then it also has an atrophic component because the signaling of the insulin is damaged. So you can actually look at the IRS1, which is downstream from the insulin receptor, and see that it is phosphorylated on specific serines and threonines, which are telling you it is down-regulated. You can see, again, you can actually see measuring biochemically the insulin resistance. Then type 3, as you said, toxic, and the toxic ones come in 3 different groups, and we were shocked to see it. No one taught us that, in residency, like, what's going on here? Why are all these people getting this disease? So it's metals and other inorganics, so things like mercury, air pollution, as you know, really nice work out of USC, your alma mater, showing that air pollution is critical as a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And then second group is organics, formaldehyde, benzene, toluene, and probably glyphosate. All of these things are organics that increase risk for Alzheimer's. And then the third group is the mycotoxins and other biotoxins. And we see this all the time, people with trichothecene exposure or exposure to ochratoxin A or gliotoxin. And we look at these fungi and we think, well, yeah, everyone's got a little mold in their house. But as you know, there are these specific molds that are simply trying to live in the world like the rest of us. They're fighting the bacteria with things like penicillin so that they can survive these faster growing bacteria. And unfortunately, the vast majority of us live in homes made of mold food. So we're stuck with these things. And if you've got, we want to know your ERMI score. If you've got, Stachybotrys or Penicillium or Aspergillus or Chaetomium or Wallemia, those are the big guys, then you're at risk. So please check that out. Then type 4 is vascular and type 5 is traumatic. And all of these things are the things that contribute. And that's why we tell the patients, hey, imagine you've got a roof with 36 holes in it. A medicine is going to be great for patching one hole. And I actually believe that in the future, we will have many, many more excellent Alzheimer's drugs that will work with the overall program. So you're dealing with all these different things that are now impacting you, and we'll have new molecular targets. So we'll want medicines that will help with things like insulin resistance, will help with things like hormonal signaling and things like autophagy. We know these things. And of course, immune support. Again, COVID-19 is a direct analogy. What do we see with COVID-19? You've got cytokine storm, you've got the activation of the innate system. Your adaptive system is not keeping up its end of the bargain. It's not removing this pathogen quickly enough. And that may be because you're deficient in vitamin D, or it may be because you're deficient in zinc, or because you've got an inflammatory lifestyle, whatever. Same thing in Alzheimer's. In Alzheimer's, you have this chronic activation of the innate system, which is where the A beta comes from, and yet your adaptive system is poor. And in fact, typically phagocytosis for antigen presentation is reduced in people with Alzheimer's. And what helps that? Appropriate vitamin D levels, appropriate omega-3 levels, appropriate estradiol levels. All of these things are critical for allowing your body to deal with these insults. So Alzheimer's is just telling you, you have ongoing insults and you are not able to keep up with them. So I'm going to spew out this amyloid stuff in hopes of surviving. I'm going to downsize my brain while I'm fighting this stuff. And again, no different. In the new book, I made the analogy, you're the president of my brainistan. And so if you're the president of my brainistan, if things are good, you're going to build bridges and you're going to do that. That's exactly what APP signaling with SAPP alpha is about. You're making synapses, you're keeping synapses, great. But everybody on the wrong side of this, everybody with Alzheimer's is on the wrong side of that balance. You are now pulling back. You're recognizing that things are not good. You're fighting invaders. You don't have enough in the treasury. You don't have enough hormones, enough nutrients, enough trophic factors, enough mitochondrial support. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that ketosis is so beneficial as part of the overall program. Many people, it turns out, need better oxygenation. One of the big surprises has been that people who have if you look just at their SpO2, so you look just at the mean oxygen saturation while you're sleeping, that correlates directly with the volumes of different nuclei in your brain, including critical nuclei for Alzheimer's disease. So if we're going to sleep at night, if someone doesn't know what their oxygenation status is, please get it checked. Again, just like looking at it in COVID-19, you want to know your oxygenation status. It's critical.
Yeah, excellent, excellent point. So given all these etiologies and basically the health of this organism that we call our body, it would make sense that, a medication that might affect one aspect of this problem wouldn't work. I mean, at one time, didn't you tell me that you had looked at a number of single kind of drug medications and they weren't really working? Is that
Absolutely.
True?
So we actually spent years in the lab trying to develop medicines for Alzheimer's. And actually, we did develop one which went into trial in Alzheimer's, but we realized that one medicine alone isn't going to address all of these different pieces. Again, if you understand the basic philosophy of what Alzheimer's is, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to go after one thing. Now, hopefully, the idea is, let's get at the crux of this. Is there some the quintessence of Alzheimer's that we can address? But so far, it is something that responds. Again, you're responding to a set of insults. So you really want to stick with physiology. Why would you try to circumvent physiology? That just doesn't work well. So we started looking at things that actually will change this balance. We actually screened years ago for medicines, screened thousands of potential drugs for medicines that would change this balance, this molecular switch, which is what amyloid precursor protein is. And we actually identified several that will switch you from more the four bad guys, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, basically, which includes the A beta, and would switch you now over to the SAPP alpha and alpha CTF. Because everybody with Alzheimer's is on the wrong side of that balance. And we found some, but we realized as we started to test these and as we started to get ready for the clinical trials, we thought, well, wait a minute, this is not going to do anything for a leaky gut. It's not going to do anything for your mitochondrial function. It's not going to do anything for your hormonal levels, and on and on and on. So we said, okay, we started by adding, we better add some brain training. Then we thought, okay, we better add some exercise will help with your BDNF. And as we started to play with the neurochemistry, I was sitting in my office actually looking at the whiteboard, and I would get up and add one more thing. And then it just suddenly dawned on me, what are we doing? Why are we trying to shortchange people by saying, oh, you just get this drug. Oh, you just get this drug and maybe you get a hormone. Wait a minute. These are people who are dying. And so don't you want to pull out all the stops and actually address all of these things? And so it's a completely different way to treat Alzheimer's. We're actually in the middle now of the first clinical trial. that uses this sort of approach and looks at what's actually causing Alzheimer's instead of just predetermining. All previous trials, as you know, have predetermined a treatment. Before you start, you say, we're going to use X. Well, maybe X is not the best thing. Maybe someone else needs Y or Z or some combination.
Yeah, I'm sure that it will be individualized solutions for, for brain health, just like it is for heart health and bone health. So, Dr. Bredesen, dealing so much for so many, decades really with menopause, we're in an era now where estrogen is being a bit vilified. And we just spoke with Abe Morgenthaler about, the vilification of testosterone and how he bought it out of the basement. So, given that kind of mindset that estrogen is dangerous, which I do not believe at all, but given that, what would you say that estradiol does for the brain? Is it important for brain function? Because my board, the gynecology medical board does not think, we cannot say that estrogen might help the brain or could help the brain.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? And of course, 30 years ago, people were doing monotherapy trials. They were misguided, so it's a monotherapy trial, but they were using estradiol because they weren't using bioidentical, unfortunately. And as you know, there's this history of trying to use estrogen because clearly it plays a role. So as you know, beautiful studies out of the Mayo Clinic showing that women who had an oophorectomy at 40 or younger without HRT had double the risk for Alzheimer's, even though the Alzheimer's started later. And of course, as you know, far, far better than I, brain fog is something that commonly occurs at the time. So it's clear. And then the other thing that was come out, the people who have this type 3 toxic Alzheimer's, which actually looks quite different than the other Alzheimer's. These people often have some depression at the beginning. They often will have a non-amnestic presentation. So they'll have difficulty with executive function, with planning, with word finding, with naming, with object recognition, and facial recognition, prosopagnosia, things like that. These people are often present right around the time of menopause, anywhere from late 40s to mid 50s. And we see it all the time. And I have to say, when I was training, we never saw people in their 40s and 50s with Alzheimer's. It just wasn't something that you saw. In fact, I've gone back to a number of my colleagues who trained with me way back then and said, well, hey, did you ever see this? And it was just not something we saw. It's one of the most common things we see now. People who are presenting in their 40s and 50s with Alzheimer's disease. And often it will be a non-amnestic presentation. Sometimes with an amnestic, it depends a little bit whether they're ApoE4 negative or positive. So going back to the biochemistry and what we saw in the lab, you can literally trace the molecular pathway from estradiol directly to Alzheimer's disease. So as you know, estradiol binds to the estrogen receptor. That then interacts, it enters the nucleus, it interacts with hundreds of sites on the DNA to literally change your whole transcriptome. And when you do that, one of the things that is increased by estradiol is, guess what? The alpha secretase. The alpha secretase is the protease, the molecular scissors that's coming back to the APP and cleaving at the site that gives you the supportive peptides. It's the one that cleaves to give you SAPP alpha and alpha CTF that then signal one externally and one internally to say things are good. Please go ahead and make synapses, keep synapses, make new memories, all these sorts of things. And so, in fact, you can trace a direct molecular pathway from estradiol to the inhibition of Alzheimer's disease signaling.
Yeah, and I have seen that so extensively in women who will come in and say, I can't remember words. I can't remember nouns. I think I'm developing Alzheimer's disease. They're very, very worried. And when they get on, estradiol and also, some other hormones, I mean, it's incredible how their brains start to come back. Yes. And so I think it's been quite well established now. So estrogen is part of your protocol for rebooting, remending the brain?
Absolutely. So as part of this, you want to provide the appropriate support. And of course, it's bioidentical hormone replacement. And guess what? Of course, as you know, the progesterone is critical in your detox pathways. So as Chris Shade has pointed out repeatedly, detox pathways are activated by progesterone. When you are now low on progesterone, you are not doing as well as detox. And one of the things that we were trying to understand years ago was, why is it that people so frequently develop this toxic form of Alzheimer's right around the time of menopause or shortly before or after? And so part of the answer turns out to be that, yes, you are, over the years, you're exposed to these things, you are storing them in organs. You know, you're sequestering them away from your brain and other organs. So you've got them in your bones. And so you have, as you know, this osteoclastic burst that occurs around the time of menopause. You are now releasing these things back in. But the second piece of it is, and there may be more, but the second piece of it is your progesterone decrease, and even that relative progesterone decrease is now giving you a state in which you are not as good at detoxing as you were 5 years ago. And therefore, you've got multiple hits. And you know, it's, again, everything is so backwards because of the standard of care of let's give a drug. And so a common thing is, let's put our heads in the sand. Someone's having trouble with their brain. Let's hope it's not Alzheimer's because we can't do anything about that. Well, you're not helping the people. Who cares if it's Alzheimer's or not? Let's help what it is. Let's take whatever it is. If it's Alzheimer's, if it's pre-Alzheimer's, if it's non-Alzheimer's, vascular, whatever. Let's take that and let's address it. And an optimal way to address this includes supporting it. You need your brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And good news, the armamentarium for that is large. The biggest takeaway for this is that the armamentarium for cognitive decline and for neurodegeneration is tremendous. We've been told it's zero. There's nothing that will prevent, reverse, or delay. That's the opposite of the truth. There is tremendous number of things that you can do, and it absolutely includes BHRT. One of the big issues is, what do you do? Okay, if someone's 50, it's clear. If someone's 55 or 60, it's clear. Maybe 65. What do you do with the 85-year-old? And there's a controversy, as you know. Some people believe that absolutely BHRT should be part of that because it is part of that trophic support. And again, we can see the trophic failure at the molecular level, in the test tube, you know, in our cell cultures, in our mice, transgenic mice. So it's very clear that that's a part of what's going on. So the question is, when and how do you administer it optimally?
Right. So I am very open to the fact that you might not get as good of results if you start later in life, but I have an extensive population of 80, 90-year-olds, and their family members will bring them in, and you know, I put them on, you know, estradiol and progesterone and thyroid and adrenals, and oh my God, it's like, it's kind of like they're waking up. So
exactly,
at any age, and we'll get more data, of course, on this, but I think at any age you can restore the brain. Now, whether you can do it as optimally with early intervention or not, you know, I think that remains to be seen.
right.
What about testosterone and men's brain function? You know,
So yeah, so again, you can trace the pathway directly. So testosterone does impact the clearance of the amyloid. It does impact the ability of this APP signaling. So it is very much like estradiol. Of course, the big difference is, in general, estradiol drops off with a steeper curve than the androgen does. So that's the big difference. But no question, we see this all the time. And if you just look at people in the lowest quintile of testosterone versus the highest quintile of testosterone, there's a big difference in the risk for Alzheimer's disease. So no question, this is another supportive hormone. And in fact, some of the studies have argued that it's not just the estradiol, but it's also the metabolism, and that you're actually seeing effects that are testosterone related. So testosterone not only important in men, but probably also important in women's brains when it comes to memory formation and maintenance.
yes, I think testosterone for men's brains is absolutely, you know, life-changing.
Yeah.
Men, you know, they're depressed, they become anxious, they lose their focus, they lose their motivation with low testosterone. And it's just, you know, I'm newer to this aspect with men, you know, maybe in the last 15 years, but it's really just a miracle what testosterone does for the brain, you know, clinically, not as a researcher, but clinically. So I really appreciate that, because men need to know that testosterone is not just for their sex drive. and of course, wonderfully it is, but it's for their heart, it's for their brain, it's for their bones, it's for their muscle mass. And, all of these are part of being a healthy individual, a full-bodied, addressing the root core causes of Alzheimer's disease and, cardiac disease. There's really a huge intersection with those.
Right.
I've heard people say, oh, it's just thyroid. Thyroid is just the thing that's going to reverse dementia. So much of, it's just like knowing some of your work. I'm saying, please don't propagate this. But does thyroid play a role in neuroregeneration and maintenance of brain function?
No question it does. And of course, slowing down your thinking, not a good thing. So absolutely. And by the way, virtually everybody we see when you look at the various characteristics, not only do they have some degree of insulin resistance, not only do they often, not always, but often have some degree of inflammation. Many of them have microbiome alterations, and that's been studied and shown that in general, people with Alzheimer's do have a different microbiome than people without Alzheimer's. So there are all these contributors. But yes, thyroid is absolutely low in many of these people. Mm-hmm. And part of an optimal treatment is to address that. And of course, as people begin, as the engine starts up again, you start to see they make their own various hormones. They make their own thyroid better. You really literally have it's like a failing country or a failing company when your brain is now shutting down. It's pulling back. It's not supporting itself well. It's not able to deal with these insults. And so changing that is critical. And I have to say, after all the years in the lab, it's always funny for me to see each group grab some, oh, it's just about herpes. If you get rid of that's all Alzheimer's is. It's just P. gingivalis. It's just thyroid. It's just vitamin D. I've had some, very world-class scientists tell me it's just vitamin D. That's all it is. No, there's no evidence. One of the big points here is whatever theory you come up with, whatever you do, however you treat your patients, it has to be internally consistent. It has to explain the pathophysiology. It has to explain what you see in the pathologist studies, the microbiologist studies, the toxicologist studies, the epidemiologist studies. It has to fit all of these things. It can't just be one person there. So yes, thyroid, very important. It's not the be-all, end-all of Alzheimer's. There's no evidence for that.
Oh, well, yes. Thank you very much for clarifying that. And I just want to mention here that about 40% of people who feel that their thyroid is low, and doctors say it's not, they actually are being looked at in the wrong way, basically, because it's subtle. These deficiencies can be very subtle, and the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is the brain hormone that tells the thyroid, what to do, is not actually the best marker. It's, it's an important marker, but not the best marker. So, I've seen real, I would say, correction of mental confusion and depression with when thyroid is correctly recognized. So look, here's a big one. And I know we're not our genes, but our genes do impact us. So what about the ApoE gene?
Yeah. Great point. And so this is the most common genetic risk factor. So if you look at Alzheimer's disease as a whole, 95% of Alzheimer's is sporadic. So you have all sorts of risk factors, but it's not your genetic it's a predisposition, but it's not your genetic fate. Only less than 5% do you have a mutation that is 100% penetrant, and that's in APP, presenilin 1 and presenilin 2. And actually, we're working with some of the first people with that now. And I hope that we'll be able to impact that as well. But we see, time will tell. But for the 95% of us, we may have a predisposition. So ApoE is the common one. So if you have 0 copies of ApoE4, and you can have ApoE 2, 3, or 4, kind of the typical is 3, 3. And so 3, 3, as an example, you will have about a 9% chance during your lifetime to get Alzheimer's. It's not 0, but it's not terribly high. If you have a single copy of ApoE4, then it's about 30%. Your lifetime risk. And if you have 2 copies, it's well over 50%. More likely you will develop. Now, the people who have 0 copies, it's about 3/4 of the United States. So the majority of people are in that group. The people who have a single copy, it's about 75 million Americans. And the vast majority do not know it. And so therefore it's critical. And again, everything's upside down with the current approach. People say, don't bother to check because there's nothing you can do about it. Nothing could be further from the truth. And there's a wonderful website, as you know, apoe4.info, started by Julie G, who's a 4-4 herself, and had clear decline down to about the 35th percentile in her cognitive testing. She's now repeatedly the 98th percentile, and actually she worked along with Aida and me on this next book. She's fantastic. So having someone who's doing this every day, who's living it every day, has been wonderful. So you've got 75 million Americans, most of whom don't know that they have a single copy, and you've got about 7 million Americans, most of whom don't know that they're at high risk with 2 copies. And so therefore, we encourage everyone to find out and then get on appropriate prevention. And that's the whole idea of PRECODE, prevention of cognitive decline.
Yes, that is so important to check it. Quest checks it, LabCorp, all the labs will check it. It should be covered by insurance. It certainly is. When you think about doing blood work, that is a major thing to check. And people are so scared, Dr. Bredesen, you know, when they get an ApoE4 back. And you know, you once told me that, you know, an ApoE4 allowed, us to come down from the trees, you know, that it also, and it's like, oh, that's great. I can tell people that because it has some positive things about it too. I mean, I don't really want one, but it, you know, what's positive about the ApoE4, and can we change it to a 2 or 3? Are you working on that? So that's kind of 2 questions in one.
Sure, yeah, it's a great point. And you know, we're getting to the point with CRISPR-Cas9 that we'll be able to change, but I'm not sure that you want to do that because there are a lot of advantages to having ApoE. So again, it's not that one's better than the other. It's that this impacts the way you live. So what we spent years in the lab looking at what is actually happening, because people knew that at the beginning of Alzheimer's was often an ApoE, 1 or 2 ApoE4s. At the end, you have the plaques and tangles, but it's not been clear what's in the middle, what's actually driving this. And so what we found over the years, and this is beautiful work done in my lab by Ramohan Rao and Dr. Theen Dakar, and we've published this numerous places. And so what we found is that ApoE, which is thought to be, as you know, it's like your butcher. It's the guy who drags around the fat. It's a protein that carries fat. It's an apolipoprotein. And it binds to different receptors on the cell and enters your cell. What hadn't been appreciated is that it actually then interacts with REL-A, which is part of your NF-kappa B, so an inflammatory component. And it enters the nucleus and binds to 1,700 different gene promoters. So it really does, it's not just your butcher carrying around the fat, it's also your senator making the laws of the land. It's literally changing the programming of your cells. And what kind of programming is it giving you? Well, it's giving you pro-inflammatory programming, which turns out to be really helpful. If you're ApoE4 negative and you're eating meat that's full of microbes and you're stepping on things on the savanna and puncturing your foot, you're going to die. But the person who's ApoE4 positive is going to live because they actually do better with the inflammatory component than normal. Now the problem is, and the people who don't, then the 3/4 of us, so the 1/4 is actually going to live and the 3/4 are going to die because they can't deal with these as well. By the way, they also do better in starvation conditions. If you start starving people who are ApoE4 positive are better at absorbing fat, so they do better. So the reality is it's an advantage to have ApoE4 if you're living in 3rd world countries. And as Tuck Finch, also from USC, has pointed out, this was probably an important thing that helped us as early hominids 5 to 7 million years ago, coming down out of the trees, walking, as you said, walking on the savanna, puncturing our feet, fighting with our brethren, fighting with our food, all that sort of stuff. So you do have an advantage, and they've published nice studies on the Chimane Indians of Bolivia. They do better with ApoE4 as ApoE4 positive than ApoE4 negative. Now, the long-term problem is it increases risk for cardiovascular disease, it increases risk for Alzheimer's, and slightly earlier on the mortality. Okay, you can change all of that by having the appropriate diet, lifestyle, etc. You can now change yourself to get rid of that risk. So you don't necessarily need to undergo CRISPR-Cas9 alterations with, with insertion or replacement of your ApoE. You can in fact just live fantastically well with ApoE4. And many people are doing that on apoe4.info, sharing their information. And the majority of the people on there are on some variation of the protocol that we developed.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, so it's how we treat our genes, and it's not necessarily just a deck of cards that we get where we get a bunch of aces, but
Exactly.
it does confer a real need for vigilance and changing those core root causes that you discussed. So, what are the takeaways? I mean, what are your top suggestions? Because I mean, they seem to flow right from the core root causes, but what are 5 things that people can do like right now? And it could be supplements. It could be, you have a wonderful line of supplements with Life Season, and what can they do?
Yeah, so there's, again, to recognize, first of all, that there's a tremendous amount of hope. This is not something that, despite what we've been told, that there's nothing that will prevent, reverse, or delay. There is a tremendous amount. You have in your own hand the ability to change your risk dramatically. And even if you start down the path of decline, just get in early. The earlier you do it, the easier. Now, we've been criticized by one guy who said, hey, my wife had a MoCA score of 0. You guys said, hey, that's awfully late, probably not helpful. He said, I did the program anyway, and she clearly improved. She's doing great. You should be telling everybody who's in late stages. Well, it is harder to do it later. So what I would encourage everyone to do, get tested, get a, quote, cognoscopy. We all know that when we turn 50, we should get a colonoscopy. So when you turn 45, or if you're older than 45, please get a cognoscopy. Find out what your ApoE status, find out what your HSCRP is, what your estradiol, testosterone, vitamin D status, all these things. Find out if you've got toxic exposures. We're seeing this all the time. People with various organic toxins that weren't aware of it. If you've got vascular compromise, find out about that. And one of the common things is people are dropping, as we talked about earlier, their oxygen saturation while they're sleeping. If that's the case, then please fix that. And again, there's so much that can be done now. We're recommending for a lot of people who have vascular risk to try out EWOT, this exercise with oxygen training, because you're now getting better blood flow and better oxygenation to your tissues. And that's another thing that seems to be helpful. Again, and then supporting your mitochondria. So just to translate this into what can everybody do, please get on a mildly ketogenic diet with appropriate fasting. Make sure that you have insulin sensitivity. Make sure that you're getting yourself into some mild ketosis. Even if you have to take some exogenous ketones for a while to get things going there, no problem. Make sure that your gut is healed. Make sure that you're getting enough oxygenation. Make sure that you're getting exercise. It turns out exercise is a great way. And of course, just this week, research came out saying, hey, we're gonna be able to sell exercise in a pill. Well, there's a lot of stuff that a pill doesn't do for exercise. Yes, it does a few of the metabolic things, but there's a lot that it doesn't do. So in fact, you want to go the other way, fewer pills and things like that. So, and that's one of the reasons you mentioned Life Seasons. One of the things that they've done is to collapse the number of pills, which I think has been helpful to a lot of people. So please, yeah, exercise is huge, and sleep, as I mentioned, and then stress levels. So one of the people we're working with, for example, literally can trace when she's under stress, she doesn't score as well. When the stress is down, she scores better. And if you want to shrink a brain, a couple things you can do. You can give it some sugar, jump up the insulin, your brain will shrink. The other thing you do is increase the cortisol. Increase the cortisol level and your brain will shrink. So you want to make your brain shrink, get under a lot of stress all the time. And again, it just brings back things that as a scientist, I used to think were ridiculous, like meditation. Like, what does meditation do for you? Well, guess what? You can't ignore the data. It actually does improve your neuroplasticity. It does improve your blood pressure. It does improve multiple things. Lower your cortisol. So these are all very helpful to improving your cognition. So these are all things. And then if you need BHRT, talk to Dr. Hall. So this is another thing that's critical to do. These are all important in supporting your entire neural network.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Can you just mention your book just because I have it pre-ordered.
Oh,
I'm
thank you.
waiting for it. Can you talk a little bit about that? That's such a
Yeah,
big,
thanks so much. So the first book that I published a few years ago was called The End of Alzheimer's, and the whole idea was it was a conceptual book. It's like, here's how it works, here's how your brain actually works, and here's why the medicines don't work, and here are the sorts of things you can be thinking about. Everyone said the same thing. Yeah, we need more details. Okay, the second book is The End of Alzheimer's Program, and it was named by Random House. That was not my name for it, but the idea was, okay, here's a program. And so the first book is conceptual. The second one is about the details. So here's like all the things that came up about where do I buy things? Where do I go? Who are the doctors? Who are the health coaches? What URLs do I need to know about? What brand of something works and what brand doesn't work? How can I look at my oxygen saturation? The quantified self is becoming such a huge issue, and we can all now sit and check a lot of things on our own. And we should be doing that because we can't just cede all of that important information to the doctor who may not be checking the right things for you and may not know, and of course, doesn't have the same import that you do for your own body. So we all have to take some responsibility for our own health, and we can do so much for our own brain health. So many things we can evaluate, and things that are now available, everything from Fitbits to so-called Better to the Apple Watch to on and on and on. This is going to be so helpful for the future to optimize things. So this is called The End of Alzheimer's Program. It'll be out on August 18th. And what I did was to partner up. We have a unique triad, a clinician, my wife, and a user, a practical user, Julie, who's been fantastic. She's looking at all these things and testing all these things and doing what works for her and what doesn't work for her. And then a scientist. So we have 3 different views that I hope will come together to really give people some important information.
Well, that's critical. Everyone who turns 30, that is the gift they have to receive. And by 40, absolutely, you need this book. So, this is groundbreaking. This is beautiful. Dr. Bredesen, when I look at greatness and I see it embodied in you, the enthusiasm, the intensity, the vision that you have for other people, what's important in your life? Because you're the teacher of men and women. Mm-hmm. So what would you teach us from your life that's been important, that's really vital for a good life, for a life that's, that brings you joy? What's been important for you?
Well, I should probably be asking you about this because you've thought about this so much. But I think the thing that has become clear to me over the years is that every single person has special characteristics. Everybody has something. Someone's going to be a great football player, a great linebacker, or a great dunker of basketballs, or a great politician, or what have you. Everybody has their own special skill set. And I think, to me, life's journey is about finding what that skill set, what you do well, and that will bring you happiness. And I have to say, nothing makes me happier than getting emails from people that say, I went on this program, I'm so much better, I've been able to go back to work, things are great, it's changed our family, it's given us hope, this sort of thing. And we hear this now all the time. It's so great. And at the same time, nothing keeps me up worrying at night more than people who say, I tried this for some period of time, it's not working for me. Then we have to go in and troubleshoot. And we find typically that there are certain reasons for the people who are not improving. So I think that we all have our special skill set. And obviously you have healed so many people with your approach. And to me, that's the thing that brings happiness and brings purpose. And we had so many years in the lab looking at cells dying. That was our typical paradigm. And so I've never been so enthusiastic as I have been when the light went off years ago to say, oh, wait a minute, seeing these cells die by these pathways actually can be taken out now and translated into a real approach to human neurodegenerative disease. And we should now, the goal is, we're at the beginning of this. The goal is to make this applicable, and it should be by changing the chemistry for what each of these areas is. Parkinson's, it's the same idea, but a different set of chemicals, because now it's about, instead of neuroplasticity, it's about motor modulation. And each of these neural subsystems has its own set of Achilles heels. Your body is really operating, like a Maserati. You're going fast, fast, fast all the time. And so when things are not quite right, you are adjusting and you're downsizing. Say, okay, I can't quite do this, but maybe I can do this. And there are Achilles heels, and we see this with macular degeneration especially. That is absolutely associated with sleep apnea, for example. Each of these different systems has its own set of Achilles heels. So we need to identify them and address them. And to me, I mean, that is, the purpose of life is to make things, make things better ultimately, because that is what's going to bring you some happiness.
So the courage you have had to be an innovator and pioneer in this field is absolutely enormous, Dr. Bredesen. I mean, I see you like this big kind of ship, that goes into the Antarctic and breaks up ice. So you're breaking up old paradigms. You're shaking neurologists. You're waking people up to their possibility. And may blessings shine upon you. May you have, continue to have, success and really receive the accolades and the praise that is really, that your work merits. So I'm so grateful. Thank you for loving us and giving us your time and teaching us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prudence. And of course, the ship has been taking on a lot of cannon fire in the last few years.
Well,
we'll survive.
We'll survive, and stay tuned for Dr. Bredesen's centers that are going to be all over the world. I mean, really stay on his website. If you have a website, if you have social media, very important, because I know you're teaching doctors left and right, and these specialized practitioners are going to be beacons of light with your work. So thank you, Dr. Bredesen. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you so much, Prudence, and thank you for having this remarkable summit. It's fantastic.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
All right, take care.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Prudence.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.